Welcome to the Smart Connector podcast, which helps entrepreneurs generate more impact, wealth, and success, attract others for all the right reasons, and become a smart connector, the architect of your amazing business and life. This podcast is sponsored by Virtual Non-Execs, the world's #1 peer-to-peer board advisor community, which connects thousands of investors, entrepreneurs, and advisors globally. Welcome to the Smart Connector podcast. I'm here with Michelle Lestas. Welcome, Michelle.
Thanks, Jane. Delighted to be here.
So, Michelle is a published author, a business turnaround specialist. She's also a business columnist of the Irish News, a non executive director, and chair of the Association of Business Mentors in Ireland. And she's written a fantastic book on leadership, which is In Business with Yourself. And so, we're going to be talking all about leadership in small business. And this is obviously something that is quite often overlooked in terms of the study of leadership, because a lot of the books out there are orientated at bigger businesses. So I'm really looking forward to getting into this discussion with you, Michelle, and talking about the role of leadership in small business. So yeah, great to have you here.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm looking forward to our conversation and where we might go with this.
Yeah. So before we start, Michelle, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you and your background. How did you arrive at this passion for leadership and business turnaround and all of those wonderful things that you do? Where does it all come from?
Yeah, well, it's been a journey, that's for sure. And it really started. And I was born into a family that ran a family business, and so it was a small business, but there were over 250 employees. But it was still a significant part of everybody's life in my family. So I was born into that. And I suppose I got to see up close what that really looked like, what
Mm,
that meant, when I watched my parents run that business and, the ups and the downs of that. And when you're a child like that, you just soak these things up, don't you? And you don't even realize that it's happening. So roll on a few years, and again, back to this family business idea that my parents were quite adamant, I think, that we all went off and did our own thing. There was no expectation that we would go into the business in any shape or form. So I went off and did my own thing. Went to university, got my MBA, lived and worked in London for a while. But I suppose, like a typical entrepreneur, it just wasn't enough. And I often look even today at some of the people and some of the clients I've worked with, and maybe those that are in that newer startup zone. I look around and I think you can see that they have jumped around a little bit in terms of their careers. And to me, that's always an indication that there's an element of entrepreneurship. So I did all of that. And in 2000, then I went out and set up my own business, my own consultancy house. And I've been operating as that business turnaround individual ever since. I do have directorships in other companies as well. So I do tend to walk the talk, which I think is important. But yeah, so that's what really led me to where I'm at.
yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. So what kind of business did your family run, Michelle, and what industry or what sector did you go into when you started working in London professionally after you'd got your degree?
So they were in construction. It was a
Mm.
construction company and it was a busy one. And then whenever I was working in London, I really sort of went into the whole training development side in the public sector to begin with and realized that it was probably just too big a machine for me
Mhm.
and really wanted to move into that sort of smaller dimension. So when I came back to Northern Ireland, then I worked for one of the development support agencies for government here. And that was really interesting. I was then the CEO of a funding body that administered European funds for training and development. So there probably was always that sort of training and development element in the
Mm.
background, which then led me to go into the consultancy.
Mm. I think you've got to be a real people person, haven't you, if you're in training and development and actually also consultancy, because it really is, it's about problem solving, but it's also all those fields are so much about people, aren't they?
Totally, and it's about relationships and about, I think, also having a certain degree of empathy in terms of when you are working and supporting business owners too. I do think that I it's important to have some of those credentials and some of those scars on your back, so to speak. And I do think I bring that to the table when I work with the business owners I work with, and all of them are in the SME sphere. Well, of course, SMEs run up to, they can often be quite a substantial company, but they are a crucial and important part of our economy. So it's that zone that I work in.
Yeah, and so the topic of leadership is such a big one, I think, if you're at the helm of any business, how you lead is how the business behaves, really, isn't it? So it's such a big and important topic, and I'm really excited to get into this with you, Michelle. So what have you noticed, observed, work with since you've been working with SMEs on their particular leadership styles and issues? Any particular insights?
Yeah, I mean, quite often I get asked the question by people, how long did it actually take you to write your book? Well, if I look at how physically sitting down and actually writing it, it wasn't a long time, but the journey to get to that point was
Mm.
over those 20-25 years. And really what brought me to write In Business with Yourself, and even the title in itself, I think describes, it's really where I'm saying the development of a business, a small business, is totally focused around that individual leader or partnership that's running that business. And if we don't work with the type of leader in front of us and support them, then we're not really going to grow this business. And sometimes on my journey, I just thought that the two things were separated too much. We were looking at the leader in some respects, and then in other respects, we were looking at the strategy and the profitability of the business. And so I really wanted to start to think about these two things together.
Mm.
And the other real issue that was in some ways a little bit frustrating is there was an awful lot out there about leadership, as you mentioned in your introduction, Jane, an awful lot about leadership in the larger corporate world. But for the small business owner manager, there was a huge element of it's a one shoe fits all.
Oh, yeah.
And my observations, my experience of working with small businesses was that that was really not the case. So I was keen to define 8 different types of small business leader. And so
Yeah.
the book very much goes into that.
Yes, and that is very, very fascinating because I would love to hear about those, Michelle. So would you like to elaborate? Obviously, you don't have to go through all of them straight away, but is there one that is the most common type that you see?
Well, the thing is, there's no prizes for the titles of the types of leader, the title to the name that I gave. So I was very clear that I wanted people to really understand where I was coming from. So let's compare two of them, for example. So I talk about the descendant as one type of small business leader. So the descendant is someone who's moving in maybe to the second generation of a family business.
Mm.
So and in the UK, we have a survival rate from first to second generation of 16% of our family businesses. When you
Wow.
go to when you go to the next generation, that falls to 3%.
Oh, really? That
And
is
when you,
really statistic.
yeah. And when you think about the number of our businesses that are family owned businesses, it's phenomenal. And it reaches across, from agriculture all through industries. So if you take the descendant, someone got into the second generation business. So that person is going to be the future business leader. They're walking into a culture that's fairly well established, a structure that exists. a fairly established business because it's probably been going for a reasonable amount of time because it's in the second generation. So they're walking in to take on the leadership of that business with that background. You take the blue skyer, for example, as I talk about. That's the entrepreneur who's really probably moving in that sort of tech world, very fast moving, very competitive. Their idea of the business is probably to grow it quite quickly, even look at investors, accelerate it into the growth stage very quickly. We have, those are both small business leaders, but they are dealing and working with two totally different types of small business. And so when I started on thinking about this and what I wanted to write, it was very much about saying that's not a one shoe fits all. Their needs and the requirements of the descendant are completely different to the needs and requirements of the blue skyer. And they bring with them probably very different attitudes and approach to the business. And those are just two examples. So, all the others are similar. Each one is defined in its very specific way. And with each of those different types of leaders comes skills, certain attitudes, certain motivations, and they are different. So, again, when we're supporting those leaders in our work as coaches and mentors and advisors and consultants, and by the way, I did trademark that acronym, CMAC, consultants, mentor, advisors, and coaches, just
Oh.
to try and define who we all are. Anyway, when we're working with those leaders, we're required to work with them in different ways because of the type of leader that they are. And that is, in essence, a big chunk of the work that I do.
Mm. That is so fascinating, and of course, my audience are mostly small business owners, so they are very much the type of people that they will now be thinking, "Well, what kind of leader am I?" So, if you don't mind, I'd love to hear more about the other types of leaders as well, as I'm sure my audience will.
So the other defined, so I talk about the lifer. So I'm a lifer because the lifer is someone who has probably, it's back to nature, nurture, perhaps to some extent, but it's someone, and I mentioned, for example, Lord Sugar in my book as what I would say is a typical lifer.
Ah,
Someone who is in business, goes into business, they don't really mind what business they go into as long as they're in business. So if you take his journey and story, I think he
mhm.
started off selling floor mops to his neighbours in the East End of London. So he'd buy them in for 50p and he'd sell them on for £1, you know? And then he went on to build Amstrad. He went on to do so much more. So to me, that's a typical small business person. And again, you can sort of see that quite often you can see that frustration in their career because they tend to move around. And they bring probably less of a concern about risk within business than some of the others.
Mm.
So that's the lifer.
Oh, that's so
Um,
interesting, yeah.
and again, you can see very different to the descendant, a totally different type of small business person.
Mhm.
Then I talk about the hobbyist. And that's not in any way to undermine in any way the type of hobbyist business owner. It's very much when I say the hobbyist, I'm really trying to describe someone who goes into business who's very gifted and talented and crafted. It could be someone who makes jams at their kitchen table or candles at their kitchen tables and someone says to them along the way, why don't you think about selling those? Why don't you think about having a business around those? And so they almost move from their craft and their hobby and they make that into a business. Again, the challenges in that business are very much around, the individual is the crafter. So one of the real difficulties a hobbyist type of business leader has is the fact that the business revolves around their individual craft. And how do we help them to grow that if they want to grow it? And some don't. Some want to just maintain what they're doing and enjoy what they're doing and the craft of what they're doing. But if they do want to grow it, there's very different challenges around that to, for example, the blue sky.
Yeah, and I think they're obviously so different. They're all so different. And I suppose there's echoes of that in I'm thinking about myself as well, and I'm thinking I'm a very creative person. And one of the things that drives me is that I want to be able to spend more time doing the thing that I love, which is being creative. So there's that. So I completely understand, but then I think, well, you know what? I see myself in some of those other archetypes as well. So I would imagine that probably quite a lot of the entrepreneurs that you work with, they probably have a different sort of blend of all of these traits to a greater or lesser degree. Perhaps obviously some of them have none, but
It's an interesting one in that I suppose I talk about the predominant leadership style and what I work through diagnostics and so we start off on looking at that and what is that predominant leadership style. And generally people do come out with a predominant leadership style. Whether that might change in their future in terms of what they're doing, possibly. But generally speaking, there is a very clear predominant leadership style. And that's what we really want to develop and grow and nurture and work with.
yeah, that's
And
interesting.
I mean, it's very difficult to put the traits of a blue skyer onto the hobbyist, for example, because they're just very different. And yet they're both in business. They both need to make it work, but it's just a very different journey.
Mm. So we've looked at 4, I think 4, is it? So what are the other ones then, Michelle?
So I talk about the progressor. So the
Mm,
progressor is someone who works in an industry. They know it really well. So let's say, for example, someone in a recruitment business or
mm,
an electrician or hairdressers or so people who work in a deputy role within that industry for someone else. And then they make the decision that actually, I think I could do this myself. And they take
mm,
that sideways step. And I talk about the progressor. So they come into their business with a really detailed understanding of their industry and their sector. Whether they completely understand the need and the leadership required to run a successful small business is
mm,
quite different because they've been in a deputy role. And
mm,
sometimes the networks that they've developed in that deputy role also don't always follow them into their own business, which a lot of them may find quite, alarming in some ways. But networks tend to be perhaps with the business they left rather than the business that they're trying to set up. So the progressor has very different challenges and also really different skills. So, when you're working with a progressor, I always say to people, I'm never going to know your industry as good as you know it. There might be other things that I bring to the table, but it's not necessarily that.
yeah. No, I can think when I talk to some of my clients or connections, I definitely meet a few progressors in there for sure, because it's a very, I suppose, a very classic way to kind of jump out of corporate and start running your own show, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and absolutely. And that's a really good example as well. So it looks like it could be sometimes from the inside, it looks like it could be an easy enough move, but then there's quite a lot of challenges for those individuals as they meet those and they realize that as it sort of comes up to meet them on that journey.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, so more, Michelle? Fascinating.
Yep. So, yep. And so I've also defined what I call the game changer. So that is someone who goes into small business and sets up a small business because they're passionate about something. Usually it's about changing consumer behavior around a particular issue.
Mm.
And I often talk about, for example, think back to the 1980s, afraid I can think back there, and Anita Roddick and the Body Shop. And I remember, walking up Oxford Street with the little sort of plastic bottle of cleanser to refill it, in the Body Shop. And in many ways, she was a woman ahead of her time
Oh, yeah.
because she was all about she was about recycling. She was
Mm.
about lack of cruelty to animals. She was about
Mm.
fair trade. She actually wasn't really that much about cosmetics. That just happened to be the vehicle for what she wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think particularly now I can see coming out of our universities in particular, but not just our universities, but there's an awful lot of you know, people in their 20s in particular looking at that sort of the game changing world. And, that, and we have some really successful companies around the game changing world. So again, they're still in small business, they're still running a small business, but their whole approach and culture and ethos to that is different to the others.
Mm.
It just
So it's
is.
cause driven.
Cause driven. And then I think we're on probably the final one. I talk about the academic. So the
Mm.
academic is the type of small business leader who's coming from that world and that background. And they're, you know, maybe working on spin out companies from academia. They could be teachers, lecturers, it could be students, it could be PhD students, but they're basically taking research and development, taking a concept, and the whole idea is that they're trying to commercialize that. And one of the unique aspects of the academic leader, by the way, is that continuous need to improve and improve and improve the concept or the idea pre commercialization. So, one of
Oh,
the things Yeah, one of the things that's often for us, I think, as CMAX, is to make sure that we help them to work towards that commercialization position. And that, as you and I know, Jane, products and services, when you take them to market, are never perfect. And the market will actually give you that feedback. And so the important thing for the academics is and that type of leadership is moving their concepts and having the confidence in that it will succeed in the marketplace. So
yeah.
again, different type of leader entirely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's so interesting, Michelle. And when you wrote your book and you came up with these different leadership types, was this this just come from your experience, obviously, of working with all these different types, or was there some research that you tapped into, or how did you actually come up with all these ideas? Because they're so good.
Well, the actual types of leadership is really was a lot of that was down to my experiences, my work, and I've worked with thousands of small business leaders, and
Yeah.
that came to the fore. However, there was a psychologist in the 1960s, John Turner,
Mhm.
and I did base, and he looked at what we call social identity theory.
Ah.
And what John Turner actually said was, we as individuals usually surround ourselves by the things that we identify with. So, for example, I might join a sports club that reflects who I am. You know, whether that's boxing or golf or swimming. Okay, so I'm going to pick one of those because of what I identify with. I might pick a religion because of what I identify with. So, and so on and so forth. So, in a way, when I looked at my types of leadership, I was also looking what are the traits and the motivations and the strengths that they identify with
Mm.
that help them to be good leaders. And then post the book, what became really important for me and what I do a lot of work on now is bringing that. I've developed a model that brings that sort of thinking to the fore, which is saying, let's bring this leadership and focus on productivity and profitability. So let's work with the leadership and the individual in a strategic way that really helps that business to grow profitably and productively. And I've really developed a lot of work around that.
Yeah, well, it sounds fantastic. And Michelle, do you work in any particular industry verticals, or do you just work across the board?
It really is across the board because it's applicable across the board.
Mm,
You do perhaps sometimes tend to find higher percentage of types of leaders in particular industries. I mean, for example, you would expect to find the IT sector would probably have a reasonable number of blue skiers and academics, whereas in the artistic and craft sector, you might find more hobbyists. So you do find that there can be more density of leadership in particular industries, but I work across them.
mm. When you say density of leadership, what do you mean by that?
Numbers, purely in terms of numbers, so that you just might get a higher number of a particular type of leadership within a particular industry.
Mm,
And I now also train other coaches, mentors,
mm,
and advisors and consultants to work with my model in terms of how they support their clients. And that
mm.
proving to be really interesting.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely amazing. So, Michelle, how fantastic and what a insightful and interesting conversation. So, for somebody that is actually thinking about the leadership challenges in their business right now, what would be your top three tips, would you say, in terms of how to tackle the task of leadership?
Back to what I suppose where we started the conversation, I think really importantly is relationships,
Hmm.
building relationships, surrounding yourself with. I do talk about those types of leaderships that are complementary and that those where there's more of a polarity, if you like, between them.
Mm,
And it's really important in small business that A, we don't surround ourselves by people who are always saying yes. Equally, that we don't always surround ourselves by people who are saying no. And it's about getting a balance of those leaderships in your circle, in your team. Your
mm,
team could be external, we've lots of solopreneurs, but just make sure that those relationships are being built and developed and that you're bringing in and you're allowing yourself to be open-minded to different things that different types of leaders may offer you, whether that's in your networks, in your support network, whatever that happens to be. So I think relationships is one. Two, I talk a lot about having a balance of functions and leadership. So there's natural hinterlands where particular leaders types will go. So for example, take the hobbyist, their focus is quite often on the production. It's on perfecting the skill and the craft. But there needs to be an element perhaps of commercialization and entrepreneurship in there. There also
mm,
may need to be management of other people. So my second tip is within that, I talk about a trio of functions and leadership. And within that, I think it's really important to get a balance. You need to balance out. Sometimes the balance will be a little bit out of sync because of what's going on in the business, but it's about striving to get that balance back in again. Because if you've too much going on in production and not enough looking at the management, things are going to get missed and lost. And the third tip is, and sometimes this is a really difficult one, I talk about the hero complex. Okay.
mm,
So the hero complex that can often be a noose around the neck of the development of your business. And by that, I mean that, you know, in small business, we've all been there. the small business is it's the thing that you've developed. You've been awake at night thinking about it. You've grown it from this idea into something. And then we get to this point where all of the decisions are going through you. I talk about the hero, those decisions are all having to come through you as an individual. And part of the growth of your business is about letting go as well as taking on board. So, my third tip is look at the things that you really need to hold on to: strategy, the vision, setting that direction, setting the culture, and letting go of the things that you really don't need to hold on to. The
Mm.
administration, all of those things that really you can bring other people in to do those things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sometimes it's just very difficult, isn't it, when you're a small business leader to make those decisions by yourself. And that's obviously why we do need people like you and all those wonderful coaches, consultants, advisors, and mentors to help us, because we're just always like that, aren't we, up against our own businesses when we have a small business to run. And that insight from outside is just so valuable, isn't it? It makes all the difference. I really believe that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you with us today, Michelle. I have so enjoyed our conversation. It's been absolutely fascinating. So, do you have a copy of your book, or can you tell us where to get your book?
Yeah, you can get it on Waterstones online. This is Michelle Lestas. If you search that, you'll find the book. You can get it on Amazon, both physically, and you can also get it digitally on Amazon. And from the publishers themselves, they have their own website. It was Orpen Press, ORPEN, and you can buy through Orpen Press. You can get any of the above.
Well, that's amazing, and we'll put the link in the chat as well. So wherever you're watching this, if you'd like to buy Michelle's book and learn more about her, about all these different leadership styles, then click on the link as well. Well, thank you so much, Michelle, again, and I'm going to be interviewed by you for your podcast soon.
I
So
know.
looking forward to that as well.
I
Okay,
know.
thanks for
Jane,
joining.
thank you. Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Jane Bayler is the Smart Connector, a London based, passionate serial entrepreneur, brand marketer, and business growth exploder who helps overlooked and undervalued consultants and sector experts generate consistent, scalable revenues through becoming the go to choice of their dream clients. If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd really appreciate you liking, rating, and reviewing the podcast on the platform you've heard it on. And check out the links in the show notes if you'd like to connect with Jane or any of her guests in person. Thank you for listening, and come back soon.